smaller. This session is billed as a stock taking. We are extremely fortunate to have with us representatives from a number of countries whose narratives and whose experiences and indeed whose expectations will differ somewhat. I'd like to invite them up onto the stage now if I could. Anders Samuelsen is Denmark's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Arun Jaitley is Minister of Finance, Corporate Affairs and Defence in India. Magdalena Andersson is Sweden's Minister of Finance. Henrique Merel is Brazil's Minister of Finance. And Stephen Shobo is Australia's Minister of Trade, Tourism and Investment. Welcome to you all. Please join me up on the stage. Good. Can you all hear me through this microphone? Okay, thank you very much indeed. What I'd like to do, and I would like to keep this as conversational as I possibly can, and then I'm going to invite a couple of discussants up onto the stage to join us at the end to provide their thoughts. I'm going to pose a question to each panelist. We'll hear their stand, if you like, and then we'll open this up into an interactive conversation. Minister Samuelsen, let me start with you. We have heard already some of the measures that Denmark has taken. Let me ask this rather, I guess, a little bit provocatively. How dangerously late have we left this? Do wake-up calls get any louder than the wake-up call we're hearing right now?
Well, first of all, I think we have to remember that in a country like Denmark, if we look at the polls, it's about 65 or 70% of the Danes who think that globalization is an opportunity. So there's still quite a positive attitude towards globalization, and I think one of the reasons is, of course, a country like Denmark, a small country, we have been used to trading with the other countries, and we know that we have become rich because we were able to trade and negotiate and make deals with others. So this is one part of it. I think what is very important for us as politicians is that we sometimes tend to give answers to the bad answers to the good question of globalization. So this is, let me try to explain this. When those who are against globalization, or those who tend to make people fear globalization, when they give their answers, they are quite easy answers, but they are wrong answers, I guess. This is in my opinion. And then we try to give answers to their answers instead of answering the original question. How can we build the bridge? How can we make people more secure, looking into a new future where a lot of people tell them that they will not have new opportunities and so on? Before I entered politics, I worked with deaf and hard of hearing people. So this is perhaps just a small story. What we tried to do was to find new jobs for them because they had a unemployment level at 40% or something like that. With new technologies, this was also a arrival of a lot of new opportunities. First, they could, with the Nokia 3210, I guess it was called, the telephone, they could text each other. They couldn't do that before. They're not that good at writing because they didn't have this high level of education. Now, with the iPhone and so on, they can speak together quite easily. And not even that, just to end this short story, the new technologies, the new opportunities and so on will in fact bring a situation where perhaps in 10 years from now, we more or less don't have any deaf people in the world. Because now they have the cochlear implants. This is also a part of the story that new technologies gives new opportunities, and it in fact enables people who before had a difficult situation being part of society and being part of the world to enter that. So My point is just, in short, don't forget all the new opportunities. Don't forget that a lot of people have been giving new opportunities in jobs, but also in being able to travel around the world, see the world, and so on.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And we will come back to the Disruption Council, and indeed we will come back to trade and protectionism, which of course is a critical piece for Denmark and indeed Sweden. Minister Jaitley, given the recent rise in nationalism, the surge in protectionism, the America First vision, give us a sense of how under threat you feel the globalization process is right now. If a shake-up will be enough, or if a rethinking is required.
Well, I think it's certainly an issue which the world will need to address. Because if one of the most powerful economies in the world starts looking inward, it's not an event which can be ignored. But I do believe that virtually country after country which has benefited from the economic order that globalization set in, it's going to be extremely difficult for the protectionist debate eventually to succeed. It will be difficult because you may have to blend your domestic policies with the global requirement. That could always be a reality in any economy. But then if you expect your own companies to hire services which are costlier, if you want your own companies to purchase goods which are globally not competitive, then it's probably not in the larger interest of your own corporations. And eventually that alternative narrative, I think, will sooner than later set in. And therefore, it's going to counter the narrative which we currently have in progress. And therefore, even though it's a real issue being debated in the United States and in some other economies in the world, but I think the harsh reality of economy itself will eventually provide an answer to it.
So I don't know if we have another microphone anywhere we could use. I want to try and make this a discussion. It's a little bit difficult with one mic. So you're optimistic, and your response is we sit it out, and you'll win out in the end. Protectionism will not.
Well, I'll just my optimism is based on several experiences. And if I just may take a minute or two, the experience which we have in our own country, India, till 1991, we were highly regulated and protectionist. Our normal average was 2 to 3% growth, with a very large section of the population living in poverty. 1991, we set in a process of first domestic reforms, liberalization, and then started globally integrating. And I think over the last 25, 26 years, the enormous amount of benefit that we've had today, even as a developing or an emerging economy, we don't find even a single whisper of protectionism because people have actually felt the advantages of the new economic order that is set in.
Okay. All right. This is something we'll come back to. Minister Anderson, let me bring you in here. Again, trade, the bread and butter of a country like Sweden. How under threat do you feel the system is? How concerned is your government by what you're hearing? Or do you share the sentiments of Minister Jaitley?
Of course, I'm concerned, but I'm also optimistic. I mean, what we have seen during the last decade is a fantastic development in the world where so many families have been lifted out of poverty. We see middle class growing in so many countries, and this is due to free trade globalization. So, I mean, there is room for lots of optimism. But of course, at the same time, in several countries, not the least in OECD countries, large part of the working class population have not seen their income increases during the last decades, whereas they've seen the richest running ahead. And of course, people aren't stupid. If they don't feel they are gaining from globalization, how can you expect them to be enthusiastic about it? So, I mean, we do have to do the homework to have a more inclusive growth. And I think what makes me optimistic here is that being here discussing this today, being in Washington at the IMF and World Bank meeting, we were discussing inclusive growth. In Davos, inclusive growth was on everyone's lips. So, I mean, this is something we're becoming aware of, because I think people are realizing, also business leaders and people in the top of the income distribution, unless we are able to share the prosperities from globalization in a better way than we're doing right now, they will be suffering as well. But then you have to start talking. I mean, most people say, yes, inclusive growth is a very good thing. And lots of people agree on it. But then there's another part. How do we make it more inclusive? Then we need more redistribution, and we need better salaries and wages. And that's a bit more tough discussion, which I think is important that we start taking right now.
Absolutely. Quick follow-on question to that. Do you see a situation where and when less globalization is good for Sweden?
No.
You don't?
I don't see, I mean, sitting next to the Indian Minister of Finance, I don't see a threat. I see market opportunities.
Okay. Minister Meres, it's a pleasure to have you with us today as well. Let me get your general thoughts on this discussion we're having, this paradox that I think the Prime Minister Rasmussen mentioned between the benefits and the backlash. Where does Brazil stand on this now? A country that has clearly benefited enormously from globalization.
Yeah, I think Brazil can and will benefit from globalization. No doubt. It has not taken the full advantage of it in the future, exactly because during a long period has adopted some of the protectionist measures which are being proposed now by some countries. Brazil has already done that. It has protected its economy during a period, and the net result was not positive, to say the least, in the sense that we did not have all the benefits of absorbing technology, etc., improving productivity. Now Brazil is engaged on opening up its economy, on taking a better advantage of globalization, and taking also advantage of the exchange of information, improving technology, etc., and also improving the productivity in general. In summary, we are moving towards globalization at some point. Evidently, that we do think and are fully aware of the potential problems, in the sense that we have to focus on higher education, then we are promoting a reform on the education system in the country in order to better prepare people for that, etc., better sharing of knowledge, etc., increasing the level of the workers.
But the timing, just a quick follow-on question here as well, Minister, the timing is unfortunate as Brazil makes this push outwards, the nationalism, the populism, the backlash that we talk about gains traction. How frustrating is that for you when you meet with other ministers, when you go to G20 meetings, when wording of G20 communiques is changed, the acquiescence of the United States? How frustrating is that?
Well, when we're talking about bilateral relationship, the idea is to make very clear, and there is a complete agreement on that, that for those countries who are feeling the problems and complaining about, let's say, what they call unfair trade or other questions like that, evidently that's not the case of Brazil. Brazil is not being responsible in the sense of these countries losing jobs or whatever, in their view. And then there is no that bilateral questions being. What we are indeed talking about is working towards trade treaties, etc., more opening up on also bilateral and multilateral ways, in a way that, again, we could foster cooperation and better trade. But what I'm saying that exactly because we did not have taken advantage in the past as we could have of this globalization, we don't have also faced the same, we don't face the same kind of problems in these bilateral or multilateral discussions as it's happening today.
Thank you very much indeed. Minister Chobo, let me get your take generally as well first. We talk, I think it was the opening where we heard a fix is not enough. What is required is a shake-up here. Let me ask you this, should we be surprised at all by the backlash that we're seeing?
Well, I think in any democracy there's always a diversity of voices. What's happened recently, I think, has been that there's been an agenda to focus in particular areas on particular outcomes. So, for example, take Brexit, which has been at the core, obviously, of the European experience, where for quite a while we saw journalists writing, well, Brexit was clearly a repudiation of pro-trade policies, and it was a clear indication that there was a populist movement against trade. Now, Prime Minister May, the UK government, has said, well, they want to be a beacon for free trade. Now, it's sometimes difficult to reconcile those 2 points, and you know, there's got to be a degree of sophistication and analysis around the way to which we dig beneath the headlines of what's actually taking place. Even the Americans. You know, I was particularly pleased at USTR Lighthizer comments in Hanoi a couple of weeks ago, where he made it clear that US policy is to continue to engage in free trade, but they couch it now in the phrase of fair trade as a qualifier. China, we've seen President Xi's comments repeatedly now at both Davos and again recently at the Belt Road Initiative Forum in Beijing, a clear commitment to continuing to liberalise trade. So, you know, are we surprised that there's pockets where people say, look, globalisation is a bad thing? No, I'm not surprised, because the gains haven't been uniformly felt. That notwithstanding, though, I also would reject that there is some majority consensus now forming around the world that globalisation is a negative thing, because I don't think that's the case.
Okay. Let me follow on quickly. You mentioned Prime Minister May. Do you then not agree that Prime Minister May is offering voters a retreat from globalisation, a retreat from international liberalism to some extent?
Yeah, that's not been our experience. The conversations I've had with, for example, Secretary Fox has been focused on opportunities to boost trade ties, to boost investment ties. Now, clearly Australia has a long-standing relationship with the UK, and so we're seeking to explore that opportunity as much as we can. Understandably, though, the UK focuses upon the Brexit negotiations, and they would be, of course. So ultimately, we will see how that plays out. But from an Australian perspective, in our part of the world where for so long, for many decades, we felt as sort of a European outcast in Asia, and that attitude has changed. The last several decades has seen Australia reoriented itself toward Asia for closer economic integration. And we've used the opportunities from increased trade liberalisation, increased investment liberalisation to our advantage as an economy. And ultimately, yes, there's pockets where we still need to focus on, for example, how we disperse the gains that have been achieved on a national basis, but ultimately, as a country, we're better off as a consequence.
All right. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. And I want to open it up now, and do feel free to jump in any time. But let's move on to the fix. Let's move on to closing this gap between the dinner party and the bicycle ride that the Prime Minister talked about. And let's talk about the Disruption Council. How effectively is this working now? And where's it going? And can other countries learn from something like this?
I think the main idea of the Disruption Council is to get everybody involved in the debate, so you just don't jump to the conclusion. So if you have representatives from the labor market, from the employers, from the entrepreneurs, having all the ideas at the table, and we're discussing this for 1 or 2 years, then I guess we prime the way for the good reforms. And the good reforms, I guess, is still the liberal reforms. You have to liberalize your labor market, you have to liberalize trade. Those countries who lock themselves out of globalization, they're going to be the losers. I do definitely agree with you when you said, looking at India, it's a new opportunity. It's going to make us richer when more countries will be part of globalization. If US, God forbid it, choose to go down the way of protectionism, they're going to be the losers, not the rest of us.
Minister Jaitley, give us some specifics as to what the Indian government is doing to create this inclusiveness that we all talk about as part of the fix, as part of the solution.
You see, as a part of this solution, how do you blend your domestic policies to be in tune with the liberalized environment that you are creating? How do you avoid a situation where a large section of the people feel that we are outside the benefit circle itself, and therefore that can lead to social unrest and then lead to a backlash against globalization? I think the model which we are trying to follow is that if you have higher growth rates, if you have a large revenue buoyancy and a greater resource available with the government, make sure that the benefit of this resource also reaches the most deprived in the society. And therefore, while we were growing for the last several years at a much higher rate of growth, we also had a very large section of people, particularly living in Indian villages, who lived below the poverty line. And therefore, you had to have special programs for them so that the benefit of this richness of the state could be translated to them.
And how successfully is that working in India now?
That's working. For instance, 2018, we ensure that every village in India is electrified. 2019, we are ensuring that every village is connected by a regular road. We've ensured that a right to subsidized food is available to every resourceless Indian or people with lesser resources. We're now trying to ensure there's a huge campaign on for sanitation in the houses of the poor as far as the villages are concerned. We had the largest financial inclusion program ever, which the Secretary General referred to, where almost 300 million people in a period of about 100 days at least were connected to the banking system. We now have state support, which is a direct cash transfer which takes place to the accounts of those poor people. And therefore, when you have these kind of small gains being translated to them, the sense of satisfaction that we are also benefiting from the enrichment of the state starts translating. I don't still think it's enough. A lot will have to be done over the next 2 decades or so in order to pull them out of poverty. But I think steps like this blend domestic policy and then get popular support to the both liberalization and the globalization process, which is otherwise on in the society.
Minister Merez, give us a sense of what is happening in your country, again, at the domestic level, and the way this feeds in with international cooperation and collaboration that is so essential to this whole piece. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think that what basically we are doing now is opening up discussions with several countries in order to open trade and celebrate this kind of agreement. We are evidently now doing the work to join OECD as a very important move towards that direction. We are also liberalizing the labor market and take all the necessary measures in order to be able to better take advantage and to better open the markets, etc., enabling then the country to be part of this overall globalization system in its better way, in the sense of taking advantage of it has to offer. And at the same time, adopting the policies to protect those who could be left behind in terms, again, of social programs like minimum level of income for people, minimum level of wage for those who are in the formal job. In summary, trying to balance, on one hand, promoting the free trade agreements and the opening up, and at the same time, adopting the policies which protect basically the internal market, etc., and evidently the workers.
All right. I'll come back to emerging markets again, and the extent to which they should be leading, I guess, the new thrust of globalization in just a minute. Minister Samuelsson, let me, Anderson, excuse me. Does Sweden have anything similar to the Disruption Council? Is it something you think that you could make work in your country as well?
Yes, definitely. That sounds like a very interesting idea, and I think the idea behind it is important. But what we have to, I think, and we all understand that in a globalized world or in a modern economy, we can never protect the jobs as such, but we do have a responsibility to protect the workers. And this is what we have to do in order to better redistribute the gains from globalization. I mean, we do need in order also to have an acceptance for a flexible labor market, there must be security the day when you lose your jobs. We do need to have reasonable unemployment insurance in order to have well-functioning, or acceptance for well-functioning and flexible labor markets. But we also must have an insurance for retraining and re-educating the day that your job is gone. And we have to build bridges from the old jobs to the new jobs. But then, of course, we also need to have a innovative business climate in order to create the new jobs. But I was trying to say before is, in order to finance this, I mean, this most people can agree on, but in order to finance this, we also need well-functioning tax system to actually finance the security for those that are hurt by globalization and help them get on to a new career.
I just wanted to mention another thing that we have decided to do in Denmark, because we know that disruption, new technologies, artificial intelligence and so on will have a massive impact of the Danish citizens. So we have decided, we have all the traditional diplomacy, the traditional ambassadors and so on, but we have now appointed our first tech ambassador. And this is a way to reach out to the new world and to the new opportunities, because, well, of course, it's important for Denmark to deal with Greece and Italy and so on, but it's also very important for us to deal with Google, Facebook, Twitter, all the newcomers of new companies, because they create, of course, a lot of new opportunities and job opportunities also in Denmark. But the fact that you, I guess, ensample data in a amount that you couldn't imagine just a few years ago, in 1 year, I guess, we have an amount of new data which is comparable to all the data that we have ensampled in the history of the world in just 1 year now. So all of these questions, when you look at it together, it's just obvious for us that instead of trying to build walls and say stop the world, we have to reach out, and then we can become winners of tomorrow. And that is one of the main ideas behind this idea of having a tech ambassador.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, Minister Chobo, let me get a comment from you on that. I mean, what do you make of that idea, the tech ambassador? Should every country have a tech ambassador? Because if only one has it, I can't really see this working too well.
I think there are variations on a theme. In Australia, we have two agendas. One's called the National Innovation and Science Agenda, which picks up a lot of elements of that. But the second emphasis, and to go back to your earlier question about what's the fix and what does the fix look like, we've also put a strong focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths in our education system. Historically, we've got a high labour force cost base. Australia's got very high labour force costs. Now, historically, that's been a real challenge for us, and we've seen our competitiveness decline in a range of labour-intensive industries. But increasingly, it looks like in the future that's going to be less of an issue. As automation comes in, as we see the prevalence of AI move into a variety of different sectors across the economy, high labour force costs will no longer be a disincentive for capital to flow. It'll actually become, if they're appropriately educated and motivated, it'll actually become, in a perverse way, an incentive to drive capital, because they'll be able to be the people that drive this machinery. So what does the fix look like? I think, the OECD chief economist made the comment earlier, it's got to be a recognition that domestic policies must provide reskill, retooling support. You've got to raise the overall level of capacity in the population to meet the challenges, to meet a new digitised world, and to pretend that we can roll back the clock to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, is to be, in my view, highly misleading to your population base.
There was a fascinating Bertelsmann Foundation survey that I found just as I came out here. Fear of globalization is the most important factor pushing European citizens to populist right parties. No great surprises there. And those fears, by the way, are most acute in Austria and here in France. My question is this: how, and this is to anyone, but how should established parties incorporate this fear into their work? How do we win back those people who have that fear? Are we communicating correctly with these people about that fear?
Well, obviously not, since they are increasing and growing so many countries. And I don't think it's a question of of course it's a question of communicating, but even more so, it's a question of having good policies, good proposals to actually making people secure in a globalized world, where we do have a high job turnover rate, where we know that the kids, if they don't learn enough in school, will have big problems on the labor markets. So we need to have reliable political proposals to make sure that all kids in all schools get the opportunity to learn the things they need to be able to be part of the labor market, so that they and their parents realize that these kids can have a good future, either if they're having dinner in the Prime Minister's home or if they're biking with him. I mean, so we have to have the answer, and so people can actually feel that there is a possibility for a better future for me and my families. If we don't have the proposals, it's not a question of communication.
Does everyone agree with that? My feeling is that communication is a very important part of this, and the communication isn't happening, and hence the confusion, hence the fear. Anyone?
Well, if every economy gets into accounting of the winners and the losers, you'll probably end up seeing more losers than winners. And therefore, this whole debate will continue to add up. But if you look at the big picture, what does investment really involve, transferring from one economy to another? The movement of knowledge workers involves. The movement of technologies itself involves. Now, it aids the entire economic activity. It brings dividends to the economy, which is supplying these services or these articles, these goods or these technologies. It helps the destination of the investment itself. And therefore, perpetuating this fear of what is no longer the unknown, because we've seen economy after economy benefiting out of this process. Just because there are one or two sectors where you lose out, they can't be taken as some kind of symbols of the ill effects of globalization itself.
Lots of talk right now of emerging markets generally leading the globalization push. The focus shifting to emerging economies, an opportunity for emerging markets to lead in the globalization space. Will the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas be leading as others pull back?
Yes, I think that there is here one opportunity to combine the move towards exports and open trade, also to foster and develop the domestic markets, take advantage of the exchange of technology, the exchange of capital, and etc., the flow of capital, in order also to improve the investment, to increase the investment, also for the growing domestic market as well. And this is already happening. What I'm saying is that globalization is not only the trade of goods and service, but also capital investment, also technology, also all the other ways to boost the level of income in those countries. It's not only in one way of emerging markets exporting to the developed economies or not. I think that it's a much wider and full of opportunities ways to increase the standard of living of the people.
How impressed, for want of a better word, are you by, or anyone here, by China's defense of globalization and by the Belt and Road Initiative? It's not a leading question. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the progress, and it's not confined to China. I mean, if you look at the benefits that have flowed from globalisation, I mean, China, India in particular, two markets, but more broadly throughout Asia, the material increase in living standards has been unparalleled, absolutely unparalleled. I think projections across Asia that will see the population go from around 1 billion people in the middle class to around 3 billion people in the middle class. So the defence that we hear, whether it's from India, from China, even the incredible advances we've seen in South Korea, the pace of progress in Vietnam, a country that's been very well disposed towards domestic reforms to help drive economic growth. These are all sound policy statements that reflect their lived experience. And I think that those are generally very positive because they indicate a willingness, as we see the world get richer, for people to recognise that our economies must be integrated. And if I speak to school children in my parliament, and we talk about globalisation, and I distill it down to its most basic elements, and I often reflect to say, if you want to see the difference between two countries, one that's opened themselves up to the world and one that's closed themselves off from the world, you don't need to look any further than the Korean Peninsula, because that gives the indication. That is the testament. I mean, it's not, obviously I'm distilling it down, but that is the indication of what happens.
How is the BRI a vehicle, do you think, for this inclusiveness, for a new type of inclusive globalization? I think you, Minister Choba, were quite vocal on your decision to participate, saying that's going to be incumbent on national interest, of course. But at the time, I think you made those comments. But could it possibly be a model for the new globalization that we'll see?
Each country is going to pursue their own national interest. That's a matter of fact. In Australia's case, there's initiatives that we'll take that align with our pursuit of our national interest. China's doing that with BRI. Countries will make a determination about whether they want to badge initiatives that they undertake as BRI initiatives or not. That's for each country to make that determination. Ultimately, what will drive the success of any initiative is whether there's complementarities with surrounding economies. Where there are complementarities, and I've outlined that Australia has complementarities in terms of some of our domestic initiatives, then clearly an alignment through those complementarities is a benefit. Now, whether it's badged as an initiative or not badged as an initiative, media commenters will focus on, but that's not my primary concern.
I think perhaps we also should just be aware of what we're talking about when we're talking about fear of globalization. If you took out the question of migration from Danish politics, I guess there would be more or less no fear of globalization. I guess it goes for Sweden also. I guess it goes for France. It goes for the question of the Netherlands. And then remember, on the other hand, that that Wilders didn't win in Netherlands, and Marine Le Pen didn't win. We had Macron instead, and I guess that the Alternative für Deutschland will not win in Germany either. So you also have a movement in the other direction. I'm not that sure that, in fact, it's a fear of free trade. It's more a fear of whether the Eastern Europeans will take our jobs, or the Muslim world would take over Denmark. It's more a question like this. This is that is firing up the anti-globalization. It's not really the question of all the new opportunities, because everybody can see that. Well, all of a sudden I can travel around the world. I can have Airbnb. I can fly with cheap airplanes and so on. So I think we have to be careful here if what we're talking about, so we don't misunderstand the fairness of globalization.
And maybe we can throw in there a little piece of the AI piece and the fear of singularity, et cetera, et cetera. But let me, Minister Jaitley, I'd like to get your comments on the comments that have been made about China and the Belt and Road Initiative, and where India stands on that.
You see, two issues that you raised. One is, what do the emerging economies, what is their attitude and role going to be? I think the emerging economies had historically a very large infrastructure deficit. And therefore, this has been their opportunity to really pick up as far as the infrastructure is concerned. So they offer a great avenue for investment to flow in, and a long-term investment to flow in. Many of them have become manufacturing hubs, some have become important services hubs. Their own companies have developed their own potential, and therefore, rather than being a one-way flow of investment, their own ability to invest in other parts of the world has also increased. So obviously, since these are economies which are growing at a much faster rate on account of these factors, their contribution in integrating the world economically, I think, is going to be significant over the next few years. You wanted to know our position as far as the road initiative is concerned. As India, we've expressed a serious reservation about it. And that's on sovereignty grounds, because what we perceive to be a part of our territory, it passes through that. And we have, because of the dispute, a very serious reservation of the issue.
Yeah. Understood, but the initiative as a model for something that might work in the future, what do you make of that?
You see, the connectivity issues could be a separate ground altogether, but this particular initiative, on account of the factor that I mentioned, is somewhat, therefore our attitude is constrained by that.
I just want to make, I'm going to bring in a couple of other participants into our discussion. I'm very wary of the time, and I knew there was way too much to talk about in the time that we had. But before I do, because we're going to hear from the trade unions and from business representatives now, before I do that, I would like to mention a comment I saw from the CEO of Hasbro in the United States. And I think I'd be interested to hear your comments on this and the way business feels now, and the insularity we're seeing to some degree. The chief executive of Hasbro talked about US companies no longer knowing the rules of the game. Are we friendly with Mexico? Are we friendly with China? Are we friendly with Canada? Are we friendly with Russia? We don't know anymore, and this is a very confusing context for business. But that doesn't just go for US companies, that goes for global companies, am I right? Anyone?
It's obvious, businesses always want stability of policy. And therefore, if there is any disruption as far as policy is concerned, it's bound to create an element of uncertainty, which companies, not only in the US, but all over the world, are going to be concerned about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we have two different questions here. Number one, I think for American companies or for companies from other countries, the globalization movement and also the bilateral investment, etc., is a positive one, and offers opportunities for those modern companies, those ones who are prepared to engage themselves in globalization. Another different question, though, is the question of the U.S. and the policies of the present administration, etc. And I think then the dilemma here is a dilemma specifically for American companies regarding this present orientation. And then it's natural that there are some questions here and what direction to go. But this is much more towards a set of specific policies of that specific country. I think that in general, companies do have an opportunity to grow and also the challenge to prepare themselves.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they can left behind.
Go ahead.
Yes, actually, I was going to make a similar point. Of course, I mean, companies do like to have security. On the other hand, we know we always live in an insecure world, and we have to adapt to that. But I think what is important that those countries that are pro-free trade, pro-trade liberalization, that we keep on working in that direction, even though there are some countries going in the other way, and that we keep up our agenda and stay as committed as possible. And of course, I mean, for American companies, they also have to do some perspectives, because I mean, there are many American companies that have gained enormously thanks to globalization, but their workers have not gained in the same way. And they should be thinking, maybe they are part of the story why those workers are not so enthusiastic about globalization.
All right, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to invite first Mr. Phil O'Reilly from BIAC up to the podium to make a few comments. We'll then hear from Richard Trumka from TUAC right after that, and then hopefully we'll have some time to hear your brief comments on what they've said. Phil.
Well, thanks, Axel, and can I thank the ministers for their great words, and I acknowledge Rich, who's going to come up in a minute or two. I wanted to start with Catherine Mann's Global Economic Outlook. Better but not good enough, she said. It's a key issue for the globalisation debate because our members in BIAC agree with that. We just published our business climate survey yesterday, and our members are telling us that although the business climate is improving, it's still not spectacular and there's a lot of room for improvement. And in particular, this goes to the Hasbro point we've just heard, while over half of respondents rated the business climate good, over 60% did not see any improvement in the enabling environment for private investment, a point also picked up by Catherine Mann and her team. When we ask why, they say it's uncertainty, political uncertainty. That's the Hasbro point you've just heard. Am I friends with Mexico or not? But it's also policy uncertainty. So we can't just blame one or two countries for this. Let me give you this statistic. Between October 5th, 2015 and May 2016, there were 145 new trade restrictiveness measures applied in G20 economies alone. That's despite the fine words of the G20 leaders' statements over those 2 years saying no more protectionist measures. So businesses are responding to political uncertainty, but they're also responding, of course, to public policy and regulatory uncertainty, and every country can do something about that. What else do we need to do? Well, clearly, we need to be protecting openness and competitiveness. And let me make the point, most critically from a business perspective, that's about strengthening the growth potential of our economies, because that's central to being able to spread the benefits of globalisation. You've heard it from the ministers. At the end of the day, inclusive growth is a phrase that includes the word growth. We can't turn our minds away from that. We need to have that as a critical part of the question. We need also to promote participation for people. The ministers have made that point very powerfully as well. Ultimately, societies can only support economic openness when it's accompanied by appropriate domestic policies to prepare people for change, resilience, with better skills and more opportunities for economic participation. We've talked a number of times over the last hour or so about the very powerful words of Prime Minister Rasmussen and his dinner and his bicycle trip. These are powerful points to be made on behalf of the business community as well. We need those skills. Business also wants successful societies. That's how we operate best. Reskilling is important. We heard that from the ministers as well, moving those people who might lose their roles in middle-income jobs into higher-income jobs if we can. We've already heard from the ministers about science, technology, engineering and maths. We also need to do more about modernising our social security and our social benefit systems so that they fit with the new forms of work. And that's a particular challenge for some of the economies in the room who still rather locate social protection on a job and on a particular employer. I suspect that will come under challenge. It's important also to remember that participation, though, is not just about people. It's about entrepreneurs and it's about small enterprises. And you've heard from the Secretary-General this morning that it's small firms, particularly new small firms, that are the real job engines of growth. So the idea of competition domestically becomes very, very important to let those small firms grow. Let me finish on two words. One, a word that Catherine Mann used, the word integration. I think one of the reasons why globalisation is having a bit of bad rap right now is we let trade get isolated. We let trade get isolated away from social protection, away from skills, and it allowed trade to be blamed. Whenever somebody wanted to say something's wrong in the world, it was trade that was to blame. We need to have a much more integrated approach to trade, which includes things like infrastructure, skills, competition policy, and all the rest, exactly as Catherine Mann has said in her report. Let me finish with one final word, the word optimism. What was striking for me, listening to those ministers speak just now, was optimism. Yes, globalisation has a few problems. Yes, we need to make sure that we bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But we need to do that from an overwhelming purpose of optimism that globalisation actually does work. It does make people wealthier, it does make communities more successful, and we need to make sure it does an even better job in the future. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. Come take a seat on the stage. Can I invite Richard Trumka for the trade union perspective? Richard.
Thank you, Axel, and ministers, and ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by complimenting the team here at the OECD. The economic outlook for 2017 and the stock-taking paper for the ministerial on globalization really do grapple with the core economic problem OECD countries face, and that's the vicious cycle of stagnant wages and low growth. The stock-taking paper tells us that globalization has meant rising inequality. The cause of rising inequality turns out to be the decline in workers' share of income and wages not keeping up with productivity. And that turns out to be because of the decline in worker bargaining power as a result of globalization being managed in ways that pit workers against each other. Underneath all of this is the decline of the percentage of workers belonging to unions and covered by collective bargaining. Now, I want to be clear, that's not my explanation. That's what the OECD says in the outlook and in the note. So the challenge from here is we must get to the root causes of the low growth trap in policy choices. We must stop trying to marginalize the crisis of low wages and stagnant growth as merely regional, or treat it as if it's something inevitable rather than the product of policy choices. And then we must actually bring the OECD's policy prescriptions in line with economic analysis. Because, Angel, I know you're here somewhere. I'm afraid that though it's Wednesday today, we're still dealing with an OECD, a Monday and a Tuesday OECD. The economic, as you see, the economic outlook is now clearly the Monday OECD, really digging into the problem of wage stagnation, and for that we're very thankful. But when we look at the country-specific policy prescriptions in going for growth, it's still very much Tuesday, meaning we still see recommendations to weaken collective bargaining, lower the minimum wage, and weaken unemployment insurance. Exactly the policies that have produced serious economic and political crisis that we now face. This Monday, Tuesday schizophrenia really must stop if we're going to solve our crisis. Because as we sit here today, we face a crisis not just of the project of globalization, but, ministers, of democracy itself in a way that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Anti-democratic forces are able to gain control fundamentally because ordinary people are beginning to believe that democracy has come to mean inequality, poverty, and rising economic insecurity. In the United States, in a recent Harvard study, it showed that only 30% of the people born after 1980 think that democracy is good for society, and 24% believe it is bad for society. Now, that's precisely why we must not allow the policy debate to become one between neoliberals and authoritarians. We must have a humane economic vision and a human political vision. That requires building the collective power of working people, both in the workplace and in politics. Because in a world of global corporations and big data, of Nissan and Uber, collective power is the only form of empowerment that actually exists for ordinary working people. The first steps, though, are that we must stop making excuses and stop making policy recommendations that amount to ripping out of the economic foundations of democracy. We must stop trying to make excuses by referring to megaforces as technology or globalization and get serious about the fact that policymakers are responsible for the way that megaforces are harnessed, either to enrich a handful of people or for the broader good. We must stop marginalizing the problem. While regional issues are important, wage stagnation is a global issue and is at the very core of the crisis. And quite frankly, it doesn't help to talk about compensating the losers when the majority of the working population in OECD countries are, quote, the losers. We must stop the double standard where we refer to the employer community and the investor community, but when we talk about solutions for workers, we make them look like we're on our own as isolated individuals. We must stop the narrative that somehow in a dramatically wealthier world, we can't afford the economic dignity and security of ordinary people that policymakers took for granted when the OECD was formed. And we must move from the policies that attack working people of the OECD that go by code words like structural reform and flexibility, and instead get serious about protecting democracy by building social solidarity. The OECD should be in the business of building democratic institutions that give them economic and political voice, guardians of equality and democracy. And please, please, please understand the alternative to addressing wage stagnation and the status of working people in the global economy is not just more of the same style of elite-dominated globalization. The alternative is an escalating crisis where the false promises of authoritarianism and racism threaten to overwhelm the democratic ideal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Come take a seat. Look, we've got a few minutes left before we head to lunch. I'd like to give anyone here a right to reply to some of those comments, or at least make a comment on some of the things that you've heard, whether it's the stats on democracy that Richard just mentioned, the more integrated approaches to trade that are required. Does anyone here on our panel among the ministers want to say anything in response to what they've just heard?
Well, just one short mention, because I think we all do agree that what we need to do is to build the bridge and secure that everybody will become part of the winning team. But we also saw a figure just half an hour ago that shows that each time where you have this breakdown in also in the riches, in the growing. The top 10%, when the figure goes down, it goes also down for the middle and for the bottom. So you have to be aware of that. So it is still a kind of intercorrelated. So you have to. I firmly do believe that we don't. It's so dangerous to forget how many people who has been brought out of poverty and brought into the middle class in the last 25 years. The now dead professor of Swedish professor Hans Rosling, he once said that the problem for the poorest people in the world is not globalization. The problem for them is not being part of globalization.
Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll hear from Minister Meadows. Go ahead.
I think it's a very important point that you're making. I mean, the globalization is, as we started, is great for the world. But I think it's also a very important point that, I mean, for large groups in the OECD world, globalization has not increased their incomes. And that is, just as I said before, that is a question on wages, and that the companies, American and also other companies, have to share this prosperity they have gained from globalization with their workers. The Swedish Prime Minister has launched a deal, a new global deal between capital and workers, which is a multi-stakeholder collaboration, both between prime ministers from different countries, but also from the business and the trade union sector, because this is something that is in the interest of all of us to have a fairer and more inclusive growth. It is in the interest of the industry, but of course also of the workers, and we can do this together. And this is an initiative trying to work how to promote good working conditions for all in the OECD countries, but also, of course, in the developing part of the world, where people being hurt and the jobs being killed at the jobs is a big problem, and this is something that we're an initiative where those issues are discussed as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister Meadows.
I think that it's very clear nowadays there are some set of policies which were used in the past in order to protect workers and to improve labor rights, at the end of the day proved not to be effective, in the sense that they created some lack of flexibility in the job market and labor market, etc., and actually avoided or stopped the creation of sufficient number of jobs. But in having said that, evidently we have to modernize and to make those laws more flexible where they exist. But on the other hand, there are also some some measures of protection for the ones who are left behind, who don't create problems or inefficiencies in the market. In summary, now it's a moment to have more aligned policies with globalization that at the same time make more effective and more productive markets and economies in general, but on the other hand also create a safe net for those who are left behind, and at the same time to give them opportunities to improve their working skills, etc., and join this much more modern and flexible economy.
Minister JT.
I think the point is very well made. You need more jobs, you need inclusive growth, you need a very large element of social justice. And for all this, the essential requirement is growth. And therefore, the policies have to be the one which sustain and develop more growth. And therefore, when that happens, it's obvious that the object which has been just mentioned, we move towards realizing that. If there is no growth, then that object itself will also suffer.
Thank you very much. And let's get some final remarks from Minister Chobo.
I think it depends on your perspective. If you're an internationalist, then if you're in the organised labour movement, you would have to be one of the biggest advocates of globalisation around, because globalisation has delivered hundreds of millions of people from poverty to higher incomes. That's a statement of fact. If you're a nationalist, and especially if you're in a developed economy, if you represent the organised labour movement in developed economies in a post-industrial age where we sit now through technology on the cusp of digitisation and automation, the challenge is going to be this. The mantra that this is about the dignity of the worker, notwithstanding, completely ignoring the hundreds of millions, as I said, who've been raised out of poverty by globalisation. But in a developed economy, the trade-off now, and this is the policy challenge for all of us, is with technology, with AI, with automation, it is now, for many businesses, a question about capital allocation between automation or using people. And that challenge is going to get harder, not easier. In fact, as the technology curve continues to pull down and the labour curve continues to increase, we all know where that's going to go. So I think that the challenge has got to be a realistic discussion with people about where we're going. And it goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is that we have got to be able to recognise that it is only through reskilling, retooling and increasing the overall capacity of the population that we can provide a stronger, more robust future for those people.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. I agonised over where to start this discussion. I agonised as well over where to finish it. But with that in mind, I recall a quote, I think it was from the World Bank chief executive, calling for an intelligent, calm conversation about sharing the benefits of globalization. This need for a humble, more grounded approach, the need to listen. From what I've heard today, that can happen, that conversation, and the context of optimism, as Richard said, is certainly there as well. To all the ministers, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you very much indeed.